Welcome to Bleeding Walls, where the darkest corners of reality bleed into your nightmares. Tonight, we're taking you on a journey down the endless highways where isolation strips away civilization's thin veneer, revealing the terrifying truth that lurks between the mile markers. These aren't fictional tales designed to entertain. These are real confessions from truckers who've encountered something far worse than mechanical breakdowns or bad weather on America's loneliest roads. For the next 25 minutes, you'll hear 9 disturbing accounts that escalate from unexplained phenomena to life-threatening encounters with predators who hunt in the darkness between cities. Each story comes from documented incidents, police reports, and first-hand testimonies from drivers who lived to tell their tales, though some wish they hadn't. From mysterious creatures that study human behavior to organized networks of highway predators, these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about safety on the open road. If you're brave enough to hear what really happens when the sun goes down and the highway becomes a hunting ground, then buckle up. Because once you start this journey with us, there's no turning back. Don't forget to subscribe to Bleeding Walls and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started with the horrors that hide in plain sight. Now, let's begin with our first confession from the highway's darkest archives. And remember, these truckers trusted the road with their lives, but the road had other plans. Jake Morrison had been hauling freight for 15 years, and in that time, he'd seen just about everything the highway could throw at him. Bad weather, worse drivers, mechanical failures that left him stranded in places where cell towers were just a distant dream. None of it fazed him anymore. That's what made what happened on Highway 169 in Minnesota so damn unsettling. It wasn't the obvious dangers that got to you out there. It was the things that pretended to be harmless while they studied you like a lab specimen. It was October 15th, 2019, and Jake was running a load of agricultural equipment from Mankato to Duluth. The route took him through some of the most desolate stretches of rural Minnesota, where the only lights for miles came from the occasional farmhouse and the endless stream of his own headlights cutting through the darkness. He'd been driving since noon, and by the time his electronic logs forced him to take his mandatory rest break, it was already past 2:30 in the morning. The temperature had dropped enough that his breath fogged when he stepped out to do his pre-rest inspection, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world had just stopped breathing. Jake pulled into a rest area that wasn't much more than a widened shoulder with a couple of picnic tables and a trash can. During the day, it probably saw its fair share of families on road trips and hunters heading north for the season, but at this hour, it was just him and the darkness pressing in from all sides. He'd chosen this particular spot because it was far enough from any towns to avoid the usual parade of lot lizards and tweakers that haunted the bigger truck stops, but close enough to civilization that he wouldn't be completely isolated if something went wrong. Or at least, that's what he thought. He'd been asleep for maybe 20 minutes when the tapping started. Gentle at first, almost rhythmic, like someone politely knocking on his driver's side door. Jake's first thought was that it was another driver needing help, maybe someone with a breakdown who'd seen his lights and figured he might have a phone signal or some tools. But when he sat up and looked through his side window, there was nobody there. Just darkness and the faint outline of the picnic tables about 30 yards away. The tapping continued, though, moving along the side of his truck with deliberate precision. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, always in the same rhythm. That's when Jake remembered where he was. This stretch of Highway 169 ran right through some of the most active waterfowl migration routes in the state. Every fall, thousands of Canada geese would stop at the various lakes and wetlands in the area to rest and feed before continuing south. It wasn't uncommon for them to wander into rest areas looking for food scraps left behind by travelers, and they were persistent little bastards when they wanted something. Jake had encountered them before on this route. They'd peck at anything that might contain food, including the sides of trucks if they caught the scent of a driver's last meal. Relieved that he'd solved the mystery so easily, Jake settled back into his sleeper berth and tried to get comfortable. The Department of Transportation required him to log at least 8 hours of rest time before he could legally continue driving, and he needed every minute of sleep he could get. The tapping continued, but now that he knew it was just geese looking for handouts. It was more annoying than alarming. He'd dealt with worse. Try sleeping through a thunderstorm in a truck stop parking lot, surrounded by a dozen other idling diesels. But as the minutes ticked by, something about the pattern started to bother him. The tapping wasn't random like you'd expect from animals pecking around for food. It was systematic, methodical, moving from one specific point to another with what seemed like deliberate purpose. It started at his driver's side door, moved along the side of the cab to the sleeper berth windows, then around to the passenger side. But instead of the chaotic, scattered pecking of hungry birds, this felt more like someone or something conducting a thorough inspection of his truck. Jake sat up again and listened more carefully. The tapping had moved to the back of his cab now, near where his air lines connected to the trailer. Tap, 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 pause, then movement to another spot. Tap, 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 pause, movement again. Whatever was out there was testing different areas of his truck with scientific precision, as if it was mapping out every possible point of entry. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through his windows. He grabbed his flashlight and quietly opened his driver's side door, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle whatever was out there. The last thing he needed was to get attacked by a flock of aggressive geese. Those birds could be vicious when they felt threatened, and their beaks were strong enough to do real damage. But when he swept his light around the immediate area, he didn't see any birds at all. The rest area was empty except for his truck and the silence that seemed to press in from all directions. The tapping had stopped the moment he opened his door, but Jake could feel something watching him from the darkness beyond his flashlight beam. It was that prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that every trucker learned to recognize. The feeling that you were no longer alone, even when you couldn't see or hear anything to confirm it. He played his light around the perimeter of the rest area, checking the tree line and the areas around the picnic tables, but everything appeared normal. Still, the feeling persisted. Jake was about to chalk it up to highway paranoia and get back in his truck when he heard them, the real geese. A flock of about 24 Canada geese came waddling out of the darkness near the tree line, honking and chattering to each other in the way that geese do when they're settling in for the night. But their behavior was completely different from whatever had been tapping on his truck. These birds moved in the loose, chaotic pattern of animals following their instincts, not the deliberate, systematic approach he'd been hearing for the past half hour. As Jake watched the real geese settle into the grass near the picnic tables, the implications of what he'd witnessed began to sink in. Something had been methodically testing his truck's defenses, probing for weak points with the patience and intelligence of a predator studying its prey. But it had been smart enough to mimic the behavior of harmless animals to avoid arousing suspicion. The gentle tapping hadn't been random pecking. It had been a calculated inspection of every lock, window, air vent, and potential entry point on his vehicle. The more Jake thought about it, the more details clicked into place. The timing of the taps had been too precise, too coordinated. The movement pattern had been too systematic for any animal he knew of, and most unsettling of all, whatever had been out there had known to stop the moment he'd opened his door, as if it understood that discovery would ruin its reconnaissance mission. Jake stood there in the darkness for another 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, but whatever had been, testing his truck was long gone. The real geese continued their normal nighttime routine, completely oblivious to the fact that something had been using their species as cover for a much more sinister purpose. When Jake finally climbed back into his cab, he made sure to double-check every lock and window before settling back into his sleeper berth. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every small sound, the settling of his truck as the engine cooled, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant honking of the geese. made him wonder if something was out there again, watching and waiting for the right moment to continue its methodical study of his defenses. He found himself thinking about all the other rest areas he'd stopped at over the years, all the unexplained sounds he dismissed as animals or wind, and wondering how many times he might have been wrong. When dawn finally broke and Jake fired up his engine to continue his run to Duluth, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd survived something that night. Not an attack, but something potentially worse. A reconnaissance mission by something intelligent enough to learn from its observations and patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to use that knowledge. As he pulled back onto Highway 169, Jake made a mental note to avoid that particular rest area in the future and to pay a lot more attention to the sounds that went bump in the night. The question that haunted him for the rest of that drive and for many drives afterward was simple but terrifying. If something had been that methodical about studying his truck's vulnerabilities, what exactly had it been planning to do with that information? Maria Santos had been pulling freight across America's highways for 8 years, and in that time, she'd learned to trust her instincts above all else. As a single mother of 2 teenagers back in Phoenix, every mile she drove represented another dollar toward their college funds, another step toward the life she wanted to give them. That's what made February 17th, 2021, so fundamentally unsettling. Not because something had tried to hurt her, but because everything she thought she understood about the natural world got turned inside out on a stretch of Interstate 80 through Wyoming that most truckers avoided during the winter months. The weather that night had been deceptively calm when Maria started her run from Salt Lake City to Omaha. The forecast called for clear skies and light winds, a rarity for Wyoming in February, and she'd been grateful for the break from the usual blizzard conditions that made I-80 a white-knuckle nightmare. Her load of electronics was time-sensitive, and she couldn't afford any weather delays that might put her behind schedule. The dispatcher had warned her about black ice forming after midnight, but Maria had been through worse conditions with heavier loads, and she figured she could make it to the truck stop in Laramie before the roads became too treacherous. She'd been making good time, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour through the endless expanse of high plains that stretched between Rock Springs and Rawlins. The radio had been picking up a late-night talk show out of Denver, something about government conspiracies and alien abductions that helped pass the time during the monotonous stretches. Maria had always found it amusing how isolated highways seemed to attract the most bizarre radio programming, as if the darkness between cities was fertile ground for every crazy theory and unexplained phenomenon that rational people dismissed during daylight hours. It was exactly 3:15 in the morning when she first spotted the figure on the roadside. Her headlights had been cutting through the darkness for hours, illuminating nothing more interesting than mile markers and the occasional abandoned vehicle left by some unfortunate motorist who'd underestimated Wyoming's winter conditions. But this was different. Something massive and dark standing just beyond the shoulder, easily visible in her high beams as she approached at a highway speed. Maria's initial reaction was relief. After 8 years of long-haul driving, she'd encountered her share of large animals on remote highways: elk, moose, even the occasional bear that had wandered too close to the road. Wildlife encounters were dangerous but predictable. You slowed down, gave them space, and waited for them to move back into their natural habitat. This looked like it might be a large elk or maybe a moose, standing upright and motionless in the kind of pose that suggested it was deciding whether to cross the road or retreat back into the sagebrush. As she drew closer, maintaining her speed but ready to brake if necessary, the details became clearer. The creature was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when standing fully upright and covered in dark, shaggy hair that seemed to absorb her headlight beams rather than reflect them. Its posture was strange, though, more upright than she'd expect from any 4-legged animal, and there was something about the way it held itself that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal instinct. Then it turned to look at her, and Maria felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. The creature's eyes weren't the reflective, startled gaze she'd expect from a wild animal caught in headlights. Instead, they held an unmistakable awareness, a calculating intelligence that seemed to be studying her as much as she was studying it. Those eyes followed her truck as she passed, tracking her movement with the kind of focused attention that suggested the creature understood exactly what she was and where she was going. Maria glanced up at her rearview mirror as soon as she'd passed the thing, more out of habit than genuine concern. What she saw there made her ease off the accelerator and grip the steering wheel tighter. The creature was still standing in the same spot, but its silhouette had changed. Where moments before it had been standing upright like a man, now it appeared to be on all fours, its profile suggesting the low, hunting posture of a predator preparing to give chase. She blinked hard and looked again, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, or if the stress of 8 hours on the road was affecting her perception. But when she checked the mirror a second time, the creature's shape had changed again. Now it seemed to be moving in a way that defied easy categorization, sometimes appearing bipedal, sometimes quadrupedal, as if it couldn't decide what form it wanted to maintain. Maria had heard stories from other drivers about highway hypnosis, the way long stretches of monotonous road could play tricks on your mind and make you see things that weren't there. She'd experienced it herself on particularly exhausting runs. Shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Shapes in the distance that turned out to be nothing more than rock formations or abandoned equipment when viewed in daylight. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, as if the creature was intentionally shifting its form while she watched. By the time she reached the next mile marker, the thing had disappeared entirely from her mirrors, leaving Maria to wonder if she'd actually seen anything at all. But the memory of those intelligent eyes remained vivid, along with the unsettling realization that whatever she'd encountered had been watching her with the same focused attention she might use to study a map or plan her route. It hadn't been the vacant stare of an animal startled by headlights. It had been the calculating gaze of something that understood her vulnerability and was considering its options. For the next 30 miles, Maria found herself checking her mirrors obsessively, scanning the darkness for any sign that the creature might be following her. The rational part of her mind insisted that she'd simply encountered a large animal, maybe a bear standing on its hind legs, or an unusually large elk that had been positioned at an odd angle. Wild animals often behaved unpredictably when startled, and the shifting shapes she had seen in her mirrors could easily be explained by the way headlight beams and shadows played tricks on perception at highway speeds. But the more she tried to rationalize what she'd seen, the more details emerged from her memory that contradicted the simple animal explanation. The creature's posture had been too controlled, too deliberately maintained for something that should have been startled by her approach. Its eyes had held too much awareness, too much intentionality, and most unsettling of all, the way it had seemed to shift between different forms suggested something far more complex than simple animal behavior. Maria had grown up in rural Arizona, where encounters with wildlife were a regular part of life. She'd seen bears, mountain lions, elk, and dozens of other large animals in their natural habitats, and she knew how they moved, how they reacted to human presence, how their eyes looked when caught in artificial light. What she'd seen on Interstate 80 that night didn't match any of those familiar patterns. It had been something else entirely, something that seemed to exist in the spaces between the categories she used to make sense of the world. The truck stop in Laramie provided a welcome respite from the isolation of the highway, but even surrounded by other drivers and the familiar sounds of diesel engines and air brakes, Maria couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes. She'd grabbed a cup of coffee and a sandwich from the travel center, hoping that food and caffeine might help her regain some sense of normalcy, but the conversation at the driver's lounge only made things worse. An older driver named Carl, who'd been running this route for 20 years, had mentioned seeing strange things on I-80 during winter months. Shapes that didn't quite fit into normal categories. animals that seemed too large or too intelligent or too deliberately positioned to be explained by conventional wildlife behavior. He'd spoken about it casually, as if such encounters were simply part of the job, but Maria could see something in his eyes that suggested these experiences had affected him more deeply than he was willing to admit. Another driver, a woman about Maria's age who ran regular loads between Denver and Chicago, had nodded knowingly when Carl mentioned the strange sightings. She'd told a story about something she'd encountered near the Continental Divide that had watched her truck for nearly 10 minutes, shifting position and changing shape in ways that defied explanation. Like Maria, she'd initially assumed it was a large animal, but the more she'd observed its behavior, the more convinced she'd become that she was dealing with something entirely outside her experience. By the time Maria climbed back into her cab to continue her run to Omaha, she'd realized that her encounter wasn't unique. Other drivers had seen similar things on this stretch of highway, creatures that seemed to exist at the boundaries of the known world, appearing just long enough to remind travelers that the spaces between cities held mysteries that couldn't be easily categorized or dismissed. The remaining hours of her journey passed without incident, but Maria found herself approaching every shadowy area with heightened awareness, scanning the roadside for any sign of movement or watching eyes. She'd made it safely to her delivery in Omaha, completed her paperwork, and started the return journey to Phoenix, but the memory of those intelligent eyes continued to haunt her thoughts. In the months that followed, Maria would research Wyoming folklore and Native American legends about shape-shifting creatures that inhabited the high plains. She'd read accounts from other truckers who'd encountered similar beings, and she'd slowly come to accept that her experience on Interstate 80 had been genuine, even if it couldn't be explained by conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The creature she'd encountered that February night had been real. She was certain of that much. But what it had been exactly remained a mystery that would follow her through countless miles of highway driving. She'd learned to trust her instincts on the road, and those instincts told her that she'd been in the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that understood the vulnerability of lone travelers and had been deciding whether she posed a threat or represented an opportunity. The most unsettling part of the entire experience, the detail that would wake her up in cold sweats during rest breaks, was the realization that the creature had been studying her just as intently as she'd been studying it. Those intelligent eyes hadn't belonged to a simple animal startled by headlights. They'd belonged to something that understood exactly what she was and had been making calculations about her that she couldn't begin to comprehend. In the vast emptiness between Wyoming cities, she'd encountered something that reminded her just how thin the line was between the known world and the mysteries that lurked in the darkness beyond her headlight beams. Tom Mitchell had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before trading his Army uniform for a commercial driver's license and a life on America's highways. 12 years of pulling freight across the continental United States had given him a perspective that most drivers lacked. He understood the tactics of ambush, the psychology of predators, and the subtle signs that separated genuine emergencies from carefully orchestrated traps. That's why what happened on Highway 2 in North Dakota during the early morning hours of August 22, 2020, left him more disturbed than any IED blast or firefight he'd experienced overseas. Tom had been running a load of agricultural machinery from Fargo to Williston, following the same route he'd traveled dozens of times before. Highway 2 cut straight across the northern tier of North Dakota, passing through small farming communities that seemed frozen in time and vast stretches of prairie where you could drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. It was exactly the kind of isolated road that made experienced drivers nervous after midnight, when the combination of fatigue, darkness, and empty miles created perfect conditions for the kind of predators who understood that help was always too far away to matter. The weather had been perfect that night, clear skies, light winds, and a temperature in the low 60s that made driving with the windows cracked a pleasure. Tom's load was running light, which meant he could maintain highway speeds without worrying about the mechanical stress that came with overweight hauls. He'd been making excellent time since leaving Fargo, and according to his GPS, he was still on schedule to reach Williston before his delivery appointment the following morning. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning when his headlights illuminated what appeared to be two people lying across Highway 2 in a position that instantly triggered every survival instinct Tom had developed during his military service. They were positioned head to toe across both lanes of the roadway, their bodies forming a perfect barrier that would be impossible for a truck to navigate around at a highway speed. The precision of their placement was what caught Tom's attention first. This wasn't the random positioning of accident victims or someone who had simply collapsed on the road. This was deliberate, calculated, designed to force any approaching vehicle to stop. Tom's initial reaction was to brake hard and swerve onto the shoulder, his truck's air brakes releasing with a sharp hiss as he brought 18,000 pounds of machinery to a controlled stop about 50 yards from the motionless figures. His headlights illuminated the scene clearly now, and what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. The two people both appeared to be young adults, though it was difficult to determine their exact ages in the darkness, were lying perfectly still in a formation that would have required coordination and planning to achieve. As Tom sat in his cab, engine idling, he found himself remembering a conversation he'd had with another driver about 6 months earlier at a truck stop outside Grand Forks. The other driver, a Vietnam veteran named Ray who'd been hauling freight for 30 years, had warned him about something called precision sleepers, people who positioned themselves on remote highways specifically to force truckers to stop. According to Ray, it was a tactic used by organized robbery crews who understood that most drivers were decent people who wouldn't leave someone to die on the roadway, even if it meant putting themselves at risk. The more Tom studied the scene through his windshield, the more details emerged that supported Ray's warning. The two figures were positioned with mathematical precision, their bodies spanning the exact width of both traffic lanes, in a way that would force any vehicle to either stop or risk committing vehicular homicide. Their clothing appeared to be dark-colored, which would make them nearly invisible to drivers until they were close enough to be caught in headlight beams. Most importantly, neither figure showed any sign of movement or response to the presence of his truck, despite the noise of his diesel engine and the bright illumination of his lights. Tom had learned in Afghanistan that predators relied on their victims' decency and predictability to succeed. The enemy understood that American soldiers would always attempt to rescue wounded comrades, even when the tactical situation suggested that the wounded were being used as bait for a larger ambush. The same principle applied here. These people were counting on his natural human impulse to help someone in distress, even when every tactical indicator suggested that he was walking into a trap. He reached for his CB radio to call for help, but realized that he was in one of the dead zones where radio communication was sporadic at best. His cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't surprising given how far he was from any major population center. Even if he could get through to emergency services, it would take at least 30 minutes for a sheriff's deputy to reach this location, and probably longer for an ambulance if these people actually needed medical attention. Tom sat in his cab for another 5 minutes, studying the scene and trying to determine if there was any sign of genuine medical emergency. Neither figure moved during that time, despite the obvious presence of his truck. There was no attempt to wave for help, no sign of pain or distress, no indication that they were even aware of his presence. Their positioning remained exactly the same, perfectly aligned across both lanes, precisely placed to create maximum inconvenience for any passing vehicle. That's when Tom made his decision. Every instinct he'd developed during 2 combat deployments was telling him that this was an ambush, carefully planned and expertly executed by people who understood how to exploit the psychology of potential victims. The precision of their positioning, the lack of response to his presence, and the remote location all pointed to a coordinated effort to force him into a vulnerable situation where accomplices could approach his vehicle from multiple directions. Instead of stopping to render assistance, Tom put his truck back in gear and slowly steered around the figures, using the shoulder and the oncoming lane to navigate past them while maintaining enough speed to prevent anyone from jumping onto his truck. As he passed, both figures immediately stood up in perfect synchronization, confirming his suspicions about their true intentions. They moved with the fluid coordination of people who had practiced this routine many times before, rising from their prone positions and stepping off the roadway with the kind of timing that suggested extensive rehearsal. Tom watched in his mirrors as the two figures walked calmly off the highway and disappeared into the darkness beyond his headlight beams. There was no sign of injury, no indication of distress, no attempt to flag down his truck for assistance now that he was passing them. They simply vanished into the night as if their mission had been completed, leaving Tom with the chilling realization that he had just avoided walking into what could have been a fatal trap. For the remaining 2 hours of his journey to Williston, Tom found himself constantly checking his mirrors and scanning the roadway ahead for any sign of similar setups. The encounter had left him hypervigilant in a way that reminded him of his first months in Afghanistan, when every piece of debris on the road could be an improvised explosive device, and every friendly gesture could mask hostile intentions. When he reached the truck stop in Williston, Tom immediately logged onto the internet to research what he'd experienced. What he discovered was a pattern of similar incidents reported by drivers across the northern Plains states. People positioned on remote highways in ways designed to force truckers to stop, always in locations where help was far away and escape routes were limited. The more he read, the more convinced he became that he had encountered a well-organized criminal enterprise that understood both the psychology of potential victims and the tactical advantages of operating in isolated areas. Tom filed a report with the North Dakota Highway Patrol, providing detailed information about the location, time, and circumstances of his encounter. The responding trooper was familiar with similar incidents and explained that law enforcement had been tracking what appeared to be an organized effort to target commercial drivers on remote highways. According to the trooper, several drivers had reported nearly identical encounters over the past year, all involving pairs of people positioned with suspicious precision on isolated stretches of roadway. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of coordinated criminal activity that spanned multiple states and involved what appeared to be a network of individuals who specialized in targeting commercial drivers. The precision sleepers were part of a larger operation that included surveillance teams, getaway vehicles, and coordinated communication systems that allowed the criminals to track potential targets and coordinate their attacks with military-level precision. In the months that followed his encounter, Tom would learn that his decision to drive past rather than stop had likely saved his life. Other drivers who had stopped to render assistance had been robbed, assaulted, and in some cases, killed by criminals who understood that isolated truckers represented ideal targets for violent crime. The remote locations, the lack of witnesses, and the predictable routes followed by commercial drivers created perfect conditions for predators who had studied their victims' psychology and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit their decency and professionalism. The most disturbing aspect of the entire experience, from Tom's perspective, was the realization that his military training had been necessary to recognize and avoid a civilian threat. The precision sleepers had relied on the assumption that most drivers would respond as good Samaritans rather than tactical thinkers, and they had nearly been right. If not for his combat experience and his conversation with Ray about similar scams, Tom might have walked directly into an ambush that could have cost him his life. The encounter on Highway 2 served as a stark reminder that the isolation that made long-haul trucking appealing to some drivers also made them vulnerable to predators who understood how to exploit that isolation. The vast distances between cities, the predictable schedules, and the inherent decency of most professional drivers created opportunities for criminals who were willing to invest the time and effort necessary to study their targets and develop sophisticated attack strategies. Tom continued to drive the same route between Fargo and Williston, but he never again approached a roadside emergency without first evaluating it through the tactical lens his military service had provided. The precision sleepers had taught him that the highway could be a battlefield where survival depended on the ability to distinguish between genuine emergencies and carefully constructed traps. In the darkness between North Dakota's scattered cities, he had learned that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was the wisdom to recognize when offering help would only create more victims. The memory of those two figures rising in perfect synchronization would stay with Tom throughout his trucking career, a constant reminder that predators were always looking for new ways to exploit the vulnerability of lone drivers on America's most isolated highways. Highway 2 had taught him that survival sometimes meant making the hardest choice of all, driving past someone who appeared to need help because every instinct warned that stopping would be exactly what they were hoping for. The first thing every trucker learns about DOT inspections is that they're unavoidable, unpredictable, and potentially career-ending. When a legitimate Department of Transportation inspector approaches your rig, you show them respect, cooperate completely, and pray that your paperwork is in order and your equipment passes their scrutiny. What happened to multiple drivers across Texas in March 2022 turned that fundamental understanding of roadside authority into a nightmare that would haunt the trucking community for months afterward. Channel 7 News initially broke the story on March 15th, when Dallas area authorities issued an urgent warning to commercial drivers about a man posing as a DOT safety inspector who had been approaching truckers at rest stops and way stations with what appeared to be legitimate credentials and official-looking equipment. Unlike the usual scam artists who targeted truckers with obvious cons, this individual had invested considerable time and effort into creating a convincing persona that could fool even experienced drivers who dealt with real inspectors on a regular basis. The suspect, identified only as a white male in his 40s with graying hair and a professional demeanor, typically approached drivers during their mandatory rest periods or while they were conducting their own pre-trip inspections. He wore what appeared to be an authentic DOT inspector's uniform, complete with a badge, clipboard, and measuring devices that looked identical to the equipment used by legitimate inspectors. His knowledge of federal transportation regulations was extensive enough to fool drivers who had been subjected to hundreds of real inspections throughout their careers. What set this particular predator apart from typical truck stop criminals was his sophisticated understanding of both DOT procedures and trucker psychology. He knew that commercial drivers were conditioned to cooperate with authority figures wearing official uniforms, and he exploited that conditioning to gain access to both their vehicles and their personal space. His approach was always professional and courteous, beginning with standard questions about logbooks, driver qualifications, and vehicle maintenance records that any legitimate inspector might ask. The pattern of his encounters, as reconstructed by investigators from victim statements, followed a disturbing progression that revealed the calculated nature of his predatory behavior. He would begin by conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection of the truck's exterior, checking lights, tires, and safety equipment while engaging the driver in casual conversation about their route, their experience, and their familiarity with current regulations. This initial phase served multiple purposes. It established his credibility as a knowledgeable inspector while allowing him to assess the driver's vulnerability and isolation. The fake inspector's particular expertise lay in his knowledge of load securement regulations, which require truckers to understand complex requirements for restraining cargo using chains, straps, and other equipment. It was during these supposed securement inspections that his true intentions became clear. He would produce what appeared to be regulation rope and explain that he needed to demonstrate new securement techniques that the Department of Transportation had recently approved for certain types of loads. Multiple victims reported that the man showed unusual interest in securement points around the neck and chest area of their cargo, claiming that recent regulatory changes required additional restraint methods in those locations. When drivers questioned these unusual requirements or requested to see written documentation of the new regulations, The fake inspector's demeanor would shift from professional courtesy to barely contained aggression. His voice would become more insistent, his movements more deliberate, and his explanations more convoluted. The breakthrough in the case came when veteran trucker Robert Hayes, a 28-year veteran with a spotless safety record, encountered the fake inspector at a rest area near Fort Worth and immediately recognized that something was wrong. Hayes had been through countless legitimate DOT inspections throughout his career, and he knew that real inspectors never demonstrated load securement techniques using rope around a driver's neck area. When the man became aggressive after Hayes refused to participate in the demonstration, Hayes managed to photograph the suspect's fake credentials and vehicle information. Hayes's quick thinking provided investigators with the first solid leads in a case that had been frustrating law enforcement for months. The fake inspector was driving a modified van that had been painted to resemble an official DOT vehicle, complete with government license plates that turned out to be expertly forged. His uniform, badge, and equipment were all high-quality reproductions that would have fooled most people, including some law enforcement officers who weren't specifically trained in DOT procedures. The investigation revealed that the suspect had been systematically targeting specific types of drivers based on careful observation of their behavior and circumstances. He preferred to approach drivers who were alone, especially those who appeared inexperienced or uncertain about regulatory requirements. His method involved spending hours at truck stops and rest areas, watching potential victims and identifying those who seemed most likely to cooperate with authority figures without questioning unusual requests. What made the case particularly disturbing was the discovery that the fake inspector had been perfecting his technique over a period of several months, possibly years. Investigation of similar incidents in other states revealed a pattern of encounters that suggested the same individual had been traveling established trucking routes, learning from each encounter, and refining his approach to maximize his chances of success. The rope he carried wasn't just any rope. It was specifically chosen for its strength and the speed with which it could be deployed. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began coordinating their investigations once they realized the scope of the fake inspector's activities. Reports of similar encounters emerged from Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and New Mexico, suggesting that the suspect had been following major trucking corridors and targeting drivers at predictable locations. The consistency of his methods and the sophistication of his props indicated a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond opportunistic crime. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of someone who understood the trucking industry intimately and had likely spent considerable time studying both legitimate inspection procedures and the behavioral patterns of commercial drivers. His ability to maintain his false identity, even under scrutiny, suggested either professional training or extensive practice, and his specific interest in rope-based securement techniques around drivers' necks revealed intentions that investigators preferred not to discuss publicly. The arrest came in late March when the fake inspector approached the wrong driver at a rest stop outside Austin. Maria Rodriguez, a former military police officer who had been driving trucks for 15 years, immediately recognized the suspect's behavior as predatory rather than professional. Instead of cooperating with his requests, she activated her truck's panic alarm and contacted real law enforcement through her CB radio. The suspect fled the scene but was apprehended 2 hours later during a traffic stop on Interstate 35. The search of his vehicle revealed the full extent of his deception. Multiple sets of fake DOT credentials, a collection of official-looking forms and documents, various types of rope and restraint equipment, and a notebook containing detailed observations about truck stop locations and driver behavior patterns. Most disturbing was a collection of photographs showing trucks and drivers at various locations, suggesting that he had been conducting surveillance operations to identify potential targets. During questioning, the suspect revealed knowledge of trucking regulations and inspection procedures that indicated either formal training or extensive self-education. His familiarity with trucker terminology, route patterns, and industry practices was comprehensive enough that investigators began exploring whether he might have previously worked in transportation or law enforcement. The sophistication of his fake credentials and the quality of his props suggested access to professional printing and document production equipment. The case sent shockwaves through the trucking community, where drivers had always relied on their ability to distinguish between legitimate authority figures and potential threats. The realization that someone could successfully impersonate a DOT inspector for months without detection forced many drivers to reevaluate their assumptions about roadside safety and official interactions. Trucking companies began including specific training about how to verify the credentials of inspection personnel, and several industry publications published the detailed guides for identifying legitimate DOT inspectors. The fake inspector's trial revealed the full scope of his activities and the psychological factors that had motivated his elaborate deception. Prosecutors presented evidence of a coordinated campaign targeting vulnerable drivers across multiple states, using sophisticated props and extensive knowledge of transportation regulations to gain access to potential victims. The rope-based demonstrations he had attempted were revealed to be preliminary steps in what could have escalated to far more serious crimes. The convicted fake inspector was ultimately sentenced to federal prison on charges including impersonating a federal officer, interstate stalking, and conspiracy to commit violent crimes. The investigation that followed his arrest led to the identification of additional suspects who had been involved in similar schemes, suggesting that the fake DOT inspector phenomenon was more widespread than anyone had initially realized. For the trucking community, the case served as a stark reminder that the isolation and vulnerability that came with long-haul driving could be exploited by predators who understood both the industry's culture and the psychology of its workforce. The fake inspector had succeeded for as long as he did because he understood that truckers were trained to cooperate with authority, and he had weaponized that training against them. The rope he carried, the credentials he forged, and the techniques he demonstrated were all carefully calculated to exploit the trust that made the transportation industry function. The most chilling aspect of the entire investigation was the realization that the fake inspector had been successful multiple times before being caught, and that other drivers might have encountered similar predators without recognizing the danger they were in. The rope, the fake credentials, and the professional demeanor had been tools in a predatory scheme that could have ended with consequences far worse than anyone wanted to imagine. In rest areas and truck stops across America, drivers now approach anyone claiming to be a DOT inspector with a healthy skepticism that didn't exist before March 2022. The fake inspector had taught them that even the most fundamental assumptions about authority and safety could be turned into weapons by someone with enough knowledge, patience, and malicious intent. Danny Rodriguez had always been the thinking man's trucker. 23 years of hauling freight across America's highways had given him plenty of time to contemplate life's bigger questions, and he'd developed a reputation among other drivers for his ability to turn any conversation toward philosophy, history, or the deeper meanings behind the everyday experiences that most people took for granted. That intellectual curiosity, which had served him so well during countless late-night conversations at truck stops from coast to coast, became a weapon against him on July 14, 2021, when he encountered something that masqueraded as a fellow philosopher but revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Danny had been running a load of construction equipment from Reno to Denver, following Interstate 80 through Nevada's high desert country during the cooler nighttime hours when traffic was light and fuel efficiency was at its peak. The route took him through some of the most desolate stretches of highway in the continental United States, where the spaces between cities could stretch for 100 miles or more without anything resembling civilization. He'd always found the isolation peaceful rather than threatening. It gave him time to think, to listen to educational podcasts, and to appreciate the stark beauty of landscapes that most Americans would never see. The truck stop outside Winnemucca was exactly the kind of place that attracted drivers like Danny, who appreciated authenticity over corporate convenience. It was independently owned, family-operated, and maintained the kind of atmosphere where truckers could still engage in genuine conversation without the artificial urgency that characterized the larger chain establishments. The parking lot was about half full when Danny pulled in at 11:30 that evening, and he could see other drivers gathered around the picnic tables outside the main building, engaged in the kind of casual socializing that made the trucking life bearable during its lonelier moments. Danny had parked his rig and was walking toward the building to grab some coffee and perhaps join the conversation when a voice called out to him from the shadows between two parked trailers. The voice belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s, average height and build, with graying hair and the kind of worn clothing that suggested he might be a driver taking a break between loads. There was nothing immediately threatening about his appearance or demeanor. He looked like countless other truckers Danny had encountered over the years, and his initial approach was friendly and conversational. The stranger introduced himself simply as Ray, without offering a last name or any details about his background, company affiliation, or current load. That wasn't unusual in trucker culture, where drivers often preferred to maintain some privacy about their personal information, especially when talking to someone they'd never met before. Ray's conversation style was immediately engaging. He asked thoughtful questions about Danny's route, his experiences on the road, and his observations about the changes he'd witnessed in the trucking industry over more than 2 decades of driving. What began as a pleasant exchange about the practical aspects of long-haul trucking gradually shifted toward more abstract topics. Ray demonstrated an impressive knowledge of philosophy, history, and psychology, engaging Danny in discussions about existentialism, the nature of consciousness, and the psychological effects of isolation on the human mind. For Danny, who rarely encountered drivers with genuine intellectual curiosity, the conversation was initially stimulating and enjoyable. Here was someone who could match his interest in deeper questions and engage with complex ideas in ways that most truck stop conversations never approached. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, subtle elements of Ray's conversational style began to disturb Danny in ways he couldn't initially articulate. Ray's philosophical questions became increasingly personal and invasive, probing into Danny's fears, regrets, and the psychological vulnerabilities that came with spending so much time alone on the road. His observations about death, isolation, and what he called the space between heartbeats took on an almost hypnotic quality, as if he was attempting to induce a particular psychological state in his listener. Ray seemed particularly fascinated by the concept of vulnerability, not just the physical vulnerability of lone drivers on isolated highways, but the deeper psychological vulnerability that came with extended periods of solitude and introspection. He spoke eloquently about how the highway stripped away the social masks that people wore in civilized settings, revealing their true selves in ways that could be either liberating or terrifying. His insights were sophisticated and penetrating, but they were also delivered with an intensity that suggested more than academic interest. The conversation took a darker turn when Ray began demonstrating knowledge about Danny that no stranger should have possessed. He mentioned details about Danny's usual routes, his preferred truck stops, and even the names of dispatchers at his company. When Danny asked how he could know such information, Ray simply smiled and suggested that observant people could learn a great deal about others if they paid attention to patterns and behaviors. His explanation was plausible but unsettling. It suggested that someone had been watching Danny's professional activities with systematic attention. Even more disturbing was Ray's apparent knowledge of Danny's personal life. He made casual references to Danny's divorce 3 years earlier, his strained relationship with his adult son, and his struggles with the loneliness that had driven him to spend more time on the road than was probably healthy. When Danny expressed shock at this level of personal information, Ray claimed that such details were obvious to anyone with psychological training who knew how to read the subtle signs that people couldn't help but display. Ray's philosophical discussions about death became increasingly graphic and specific, focusing on the various ways that isolated truckers might meet their end on remote highways. He spoke with clinical detachment about accidents, mechanical failures, medical emergencies, and violent encounters, but his descriptions contained details that suggested intimate familiarity with such events. His observations about the vulnerability of lone drivers began to sound less like philosophical speculation and more like tactical analysis. The most chilling moment came when Ray began discussing what he called the perfect crime. Hypothetical scenarios in which someone could harm isolated truckers without fear of detection or punishment. He spoke about the vast distances between patrol units, the limited surveillance on remote highways, and the psychological factors that made drivers reluctant to trust their instincts about potential threats. His analysis was thorough and sophisticated, delivered with the same intellectual enthusiasm he'd shown for more benign philosophical topics. When Danny attempted to end the conversation and return to his truck, Ray's demeanor shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. His friendly manner remained, but underneath it was a persistence that bordered on aggressive. He continued his philosophical monologue while walking alongside Danny, maintaining the pretense of casual conversation while making it clear that he wasn't ready for their encounter to end. His questions became more probing, his observations more personal, and his analysis of Danny's psychological state more invasive. Ray demonstrated knowledge of Danny's daughter's middle name, information that wasn't contained in any public records and couldn't have been obtained through casual observation. When Danny demanded to know how he could possibly know such a detail, Ray simply smiled and suggested that determined people could learn anything about anyone if they invested sufficient time and effort in research. His explanation was technically plausible, but the implications were terrifying. It meant that someone had been investigating Danny's personal life with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operation. The realization that he was dealing with someone who had been systematically studying his life sent Danny into a state of controlled panic. Ray's philosophical discussions about vulnerability and isolation took on an entirely new meaning when viewed as potential reconnaissance gathering rather than intellectual curiosity. Every question Ray had asked, every observation he had made, and every detail he had revealed suddenly appeared to be part of a calculated effort to assess Danny as a potential target. Danny excused himself and quickly returned to his truck, locking the doors and starting the engine with an urgency that contrasted sharply with his usual methodical pre-trip routine. In his mirrors, he could see Ray standing in the parking lot, watching his departure with the same analytical intensity he'd brought to their philosophical discussions. There was no attempt to pursue or interfere, but Ray's presence remained visible until Danny had cleared the truck stop and returned to the highway. The remaining hours of Danny's journey to Denver were filled with constant vigilance and growing paranoia. Every vehicle that appeared in his mirrors became a potential threat, and every rest area or truck stop seemed like a place where Ray might be waiting to continue their conversation. Danny found himself questioning every interaction he'd had with strangers during his years on the road, wondering how many other encounters might have involved predators conducting reconnaissance under the guise of friendly conversation. When Danny reached Denver and had an opportunity to research his experience, he discovered that he wasn't alone in encountering strangers who demonstrated impossible knowledge about truckers' personal lives and professional routines. Online forums contained dozens of similar reports from drivers who had been approached by individuals claiming to be fellow truckers or industry professionals, but who had revealed information that suggested extensive surveillance and investigation activities. The pattern that emerged from these reports was consistent and disturbing. Predators who used intellectual engagement and philosophical discussion as tools for psychological manipulation and intelligence gathering. These individuals presented themselves as thoughtful, educated people who shared truckers' interests in deeper questions about life and meaning, but their true purpose was to identify vulnerabilities and assess potential victims. Ray's knowledge of Danny's personal information, his systematic analysis of trucker vulnerabilities, and his apparent familiarity with violence against isolated drivers suggested someone with either professional training in surveillance and psychological manipulation or extensive personal experience in targeting truckers. His ability to maintain a friendly, intellectual demeanor while conducting what amounted to a psychological interrogation indicated a level of sophistication that went far beyond opportunistic, predatory behavior. The truck stop where Danny had encountered Ray became a focal point for other drivers' reports of similar experiences. Multiple truckers reported meetings with a man matching Ray's description who had engaged them in increasingly disturbing philosophical conversations while demonstrating impossible knowledge about their personal lives. The consistency of these reports suggested that Ray, or someone like him, had been systematically working the truck stop circuit, identifying and studying potential targets. The investigation that followed these reports revealed evidence of an organized effort to gather intelligence about commercial drivers, their routes, their personal circumstances, and their psychological vulnerabilities. Ray appeared to be part of a larger network that used sophisticated social engineering techniques to obtain information that could be used for identity theft, robbery, or worse. His philosophical discussions weren't genuine intellectual curiosity. They were professional interrogation techniques disguised as casual conversation. For Danny, the encounter with Ray served as a harsh reminder that the isolation and introspection that had always been among the most appealing aspects of long-haul trucking could also be weaponized against him. The highways that had provided him with space for genuine philosophical reflection had also provided predators with opportunities to study and manipulate drivers who were psychologically vulnerable due to loneliness and extended solitude. The most disturbing realization was that Ray's apparent intelligence and education made him far more dangerous than the typical truck stop criminal. His ability to engage in sophisticated intellectual discussions while conducting psychological reconnaissance suggested someone who understood both the trucking industry and human psychology well enough to exploit them systematically. The philosophical conversations that Danny had initially found stimulating were revealed to be tools in a predatory toolkit designed to identify and exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of isolated drivers. In the months following his encounter with Ray, Danny would modify his approach to interactions with strangers at truck stops and rest areas. The philosophical curiosity that had always been one of his defining characteristics became tempered with a wariness that reflected his new understanding of how intellectual engagement could be used as a weapon. The highway had taught him that even the most appealing forms of human connection could conceal predatory intentions, and that survival sometimes meant abandoning the very qualities that made life on the road meaningful. Ray had given Danny a lesson in the philosophy of predation, a demonstration of how sophisticated manipulators could use genuine human needs for intellectual stimulation and meaningful conversation as entry points for psychological torture and potential violence. The space between heartbeats that Ray had spoken about so eloquently wasn't a philosophical metaphor. It was the moment when a victim realized that someone had been studying them with the patience and precision of a hunter, and that escape might no longer be possible. Linda Morrison had been team driving with her husband Carl for 12 years, and in that time, they'd developed the kind of operational rhythm that made them one of the most reliable husband-wife teams in the business. Carl handled the daytime shifts while Linda took over for the overnight runs, allowing them to maintain almost continuous movement while staying within federal regulations for driver rest periods. Their efficiency had earned them premium loads and regular routes that took them from coast to coast, but it had also made them predictable in ways that would prove dangerous during 3 terrifying weeks in September 2022. The couple was running a high-value electronics load from Los Angeles to Atlanta, following their usual route that took them through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and the southeastern states. It was exactly the kind of time-sensitive, valuable cargo that attracted the attention of organized theft rings, which was why Linda and Carl had invested in additional security measures, including GPS tracking, communication systems, and modified sleeping arrangements that allowed one driver to remain alert while the other rested. What they hadn't anticipated was encountering someone with the resources and coordination to conduct a systematic stalking operation that would span multiple states and demonstrate a level of surveillance sophistication that suggested professional training. The first indication that something was wrong came on September 8th, when Carl noticed the same dark blue sedan appearing in his mirrors at 3 different truck stops along Interstate 40 in Arizona. Initially, he dismissed it as coincidence. It wasn't unusual for vehicles to follow similar routes, especially on major trucking corridors where fuel stops and rest areas were spaced at predictable intervals. But when the sedan appeared at their planned overnight rest stop outside Flagstaff, positioned in the parking lot in a way that provided clear sight lines to their truck, Carl began to suspect they were dealing with something more serious than random chance. Linda took over driving duties at midnight, and within 30 minutes, she spotted the same sedan maintaining a consistent distance behind their truck on Interstate 40. The vehicle's behavior was immediately suspicious. It maintained precisely the same speed as their truck, stayed far enough back to avoid being obviously conspicuous, but close enough to keep them in visual range at all times. When Linda changed lanes to test her suspicions, the sedan followed with the same timing and positioning that suggested professional surveillance training. Over the next 72 hours, Linda and Carl documented 17 separate sightings of the sedan at truck stops, rest areas, and fuel stations across New Mexico and Texas. But what made their situation even more disturbing was the gradual realization that the sedan was part of a larger coordinated operation. Other vehicles began appearing in their vicinity with suspicious frequency, a white pickup truck, a gray SUV, and a burgundy minivan that seemed to work in rotation, ensuring that at least one surveillance vehicle was always positioned to monitor their movements. The coordination between these vehicles demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that went far beyond casual criminal activity. When the sedan would disappear from their mirrors, one of the other vehicles would appear within minutes, maintaining the same professional distance and surveillance positioning. When they stopped for fuel or rest breaks, different vehicles would be strategically positioned in the parking areas, their occupants appearing to conduct casual activities while maintaining clear sight lines to the Morrison truck. Carl attempted to document the surveillance operation using his dashboard camera and cell phone, but the stalkers seemed aware of his efforts and adjusted their positioning to avoid clear photographic evidence. Their vehicles were always positioned at angles that made license plate identification difficult, and their occupants wore clothing and accessories that obscured their faces from security cameras. The level of operational awareness they demonstrated suggested either professional training in surveillance techniques or extensive experience in conducting similar operations. The psychological pressure of being under constant observation began affecting both Linda and Carl's ability to operate their truck safely and efficiently. They found themselves constantly checking mirrors, analyzing every vehicle in their vicinity, and second-guessing their route decisions based on fear rather than logistics. The stress of knowing they were being systematically stalked by an organized group with unknown intentions created a state of hyper-vigilance that made rest periods nearly impossible and driving shifts exhausting. On September 12th, the stalkers escalated their operation by demonstrating knowledge of the Morrisons' planned route and delivery schedule that they couldn't have obtained through simple surveillance. When Linda and Carl stopped at a truck stop in Dallas that wasn't on their usual route, a deviation they had made specifically to avoid their stalkers, the dark blue sedan was already parked in the lot when they arrived. The implications were terrifying. Someone had access to their dispatch information, GPS tracking data, or electronic communications. The realization that their stalkers had inside information about their delivery schedule and route plans prompted Linda and Carl to contact their dispatcher and request immediate assistance. Their company's security department took the threat seriously and advised them to vary their routes, avoid predictable stops, and maintain constant communication with the office. But even with these precautions, the surveillance operation continued with the same professional precision that suggested their stalkers had anticipated such defensive measures. The stalkers began using more aggressive tactics as the Morrisons approached Texas's eastern border. Vehicles would position themselves in ways that forced Linda and Carl to take specific exit ramps or follow particular routes, essentially herding them toward predetermined locations. When they attempted to deviate from these apparent directions, the stalkers would use coordinated vehicle positioning to block certain lanes or create traffic situations that made alternative routes impractical or dangerous. The sophistication of these herding tactics suggested that the stalkers had detailed knowledge of highway systems, traffic patterns, and the operational limitations of commercial trucks. Their ability to coordinate multiple vehicles to influence the Morrisons' routing decisions without creating obvious safety violations indicated a level of planning and resources that went far beyond typical highway criminal activity. On September 15th, the situation reached a critical point when the stalkers attempted to force Linda and Carl into an isolated rest area in eastern Texas by using coordinated vehicle positioning to block all other options. Recognition that they were being directed toward a location where their stalkers could approach them without witnesses prompted the Morrisons to contact law enforcement directly, despite concerns that involving police might escalate the situation. The response from the Texas Highway Patrol was immediate and comprehensive. Officers familiar with organized trucking crime recognized the stalkers' tactics as consistent with coordinated theft and robbery operations that had been targeting high-value loads across multiple states. A coordinated law enforcement response involving multiple agencies was organized to intercept the stalkers and protect the Morrisons' remaining journey to Atlanta. The arrest operation that followed revealed the full scope of the stalking network and the resources they had devoted to targeting the Morrisons' load. The dark blue sedan, white pickup, gray SUV, and burgundy minivan were all equipped with professional-grade surveillance equipment, including GPS tracking devices, high-powered cameras, and encrypted communication systems that allowed the stalkers to coordinate their activities with military precision. Investigation of the arrested suspects revealed that they were part of an organized criminal network that specialized in targeting high-value commercial loads using coordinated surveillance and theft operations. Their equipment included law enforcement, grade radio scanners, GPS tracking devices that could be covertly attached to target vehicles, and detailed intelligence files containing information about trucking companies, driver schedules, and cargo manifests. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that the stalkers had been conducting surveillance on the Morrisons for several weeks before beginning their active stalking operation. Their files contained photographs of Linda and Carl's truck at various locations, detailed notes about their driving patterns and preferred stops, and copies of dispatch communications that suggested they had either compromised the company's computer systems or had inside assistance from someone with access to confidential information. The investigation revealed that the stalking network had targeted multiple trucking teams using similar tactics, conducting weeks or months of preparatory surveillance before launching coordinated operations designed to force drivers into situations where they could be robbed or their cargo stolen. Their success rate had been high because they understood both the operational patterns of commercial drivers and the psychological pressure that systematic stalking created. Law enforcement analysis of the stalkers' equipment and methods revealed operational sophistication that suggested either professional training in surveillance techniques or extensive experience in conducting similar crimes. Their communication systems, GPS tracking capabilities, and coordinated vehicle operations demonstrated a level of organization and resources that investigators typically associated with professional criminal enterprises rather than opportunistic highway crime. The psychological evaluation that followed the arrests revealed that the stalkers had specifically chosen to target husband-wife teams because they understood that the emotional bond between partners made them more predictable and more likely to make decisions based on protecting each other rather than optimal tactical considerations. The Morrisons' relationship had been weaponized against them by criminals who understood how to exploit human psychology, as well as they understood trucking operations. For Linda and Carl, the resolution of their stalking case provided legal justice but didn't eliminate the psychological trauma of knowing they had been systematically hunted by an organized network with professional-grade surveillance capabilities. The realization that their every movement had been monitored and analyzed for weeks before the active stalking began created a lasting sense of vulnerability that would affect their approach to trucking for years afterward. The investigation that followed their case led to the discovery of similar stalking operations targeting commercial drivers across multiple states, revealing a pattern of organized criminal activity that used sophisticated surveillance techniques to identify and target high-value loads. The Morrisons' experience had exposed a professional criminal network that understood both the operational vulnerabilities of commercial trucking and the psychological factors that could be exploited to manipulate driver behavior. The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies and trucking companies, demonstrating how organized criminals could use advanced surveillance techniques and coordinated operations to target commercial drivers with a level of sophistication that rivaled professional intelligence operations. The stalker's ability to maintain systematic surveillance across multiple states while avoiding detection suggested that highway crime had evolved to a level of organization and resources that most drivers and law enforcement agencies hadn't anticipated. The equipment recovered from the arrested stalkers included detailed manuals on surveillance techniques, psychological manipulation, and commercial trucking operations that suggested they had approached their criminal enterprise with the same professionalism and preparation that legitimate businesses use to develop operational strategies. Their success in stalking the Morrisons for 3 weeks across multiple states demonstrated that highway predators had access to resources and training that made them far more dangerous than traditional opportunistic criminals. The Morrison stalking case served as a watershed moment for the trucking industry's understanding of organized highway crime, revealing that professional criminal networks were using sophisticated surveillance and coordination techniques to target high-value loads with military-level precision. The 3 weeks of systematic stalking they had endured represented a new evolution in highway predation, where criminals had the resources and training to conduct extended operations that could span multiple states and coordinate multiple surveillance teams. The lasting impact of their experience extended beyond the immediate trauma of being stalked. It forced both Linda and Carl to accept that their profession had attracted the attention of organized criminals with resources and capabilities that transformed highway trucking from a relatively safe occupation into a potential battlefield where survival depended on understanding that they were valuable targets for well-funded, professionally trained predators who viewed them as assets to be acquired rather than people to be avoided. Diane Walsh had been driving trucks for 25 years, long enough to know that her reputation for caution wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct honed by countless encounters with the kinds of predators who understood that isolated highways provided perfect hunting grounds. She'd always trusted her gut feelings about people and situations, which was why the trucker who called himself Nighthawk on the CB radio had made her skin crawl from their first encounter at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City in April 2023. There was something in his voice, in the way he asked too many personal questions about her routes and schedules, that triggered every warning bell her 25 years on the road had taught her to respect. Diane was running a high-priority load of medical equipment from Oklahoma City to Houston traveling with her driving partner Rex Morrison, a former mechanic who'd been her co-driver for 8 years. They'd developed the kind of professional rhythm that made them one of the most reliable teams in their company's fleet, but their efficiency had also made them predictable in ways that would prove dangerous when they encountered someone who'd been studying their patterns with the patience and precision of a professional hunter. The route they were taking through eastern Oklahoma and into Texas was one they'd traveled dozens of times, following established truck routes that connected major distribution centers while avoiding the congested urban areas that slowed down freight movement. The first time they'd heard Nighthawk's voice on Channel 19, he'd seemed like just another professional driver looking for conversation during the long, boring stretches of highway that defined long-haul trucking. His CB handle suggested someone who preferred driving at night, and his knowledge of truck stops, way stations, and route conditions indicated extensive experience with the same corridors that Diane and Rex traveled regularly. But there were subtle elements in his communication style that bothered Diane. He asked too many questions about other drivers' schedules, showed excessive interest in who was traveling alone versus in teams, and seemed to remember personal details about drivers he'd only spoken with briefly on the radio. Over the course of several trips through Oklahoma and Texas, Nighthawk's voice became a familiar presence on their CB communications, but his interest in their specific movements became increasingly disturbing. He would appear on the radio at locations that suggested he'd been monitoring their progress, commenting on their truck's appearance or their recent stops in ways that indicated direct visual surveillance rather than casual radio conversation. When Diane mentioned their concerns to other drivers, several reported similar experiences with Nighthawk, a sense that he was tracking their movements and building detailed profiles of their routes, schedules, and travel patterns. The escalation began on April 20th, when Diane and Rex were forced to take an unscheduled rest break due to mechanical problems with their truck's cooling system. They'd pulled into a poorly lit truck stop near the Oklahoma-Texas border, a location they normally avoided due to its isolation and reputation for attracting transient criminals who preyed on stranded drivers. The cooling system failure had been sudden and complete, forcing them to stop before their engine suffered permanent damage, and they'd had no choice but to use the first available facility despite their reservations about its safety and security. Rex had been conducting a preliminary inspection of their engine when they heard the distinctive sound of Nighthawk's Peterbilt pulling into the truck stop behind them. The timing was impossible to explain as coincidence. They were more than 50 miles off their usual route, at a location they'd never used before, during an unscheduled stop that no one could have predicted. Yet Nighthawk had somehow known exactly where to find them, suggesting a level of surveillance that went far beyond casual CB radio monitoring. Nighthawk parked his truck approximately 50 feet away, positioning his vehicle so that his headlights illuminated their disabled truck, while keeping his own cab in shadow. The positioning was deliberate and tactical, creating a situation where Diane and Rex were clearly visible while Nighthawk remained concealed behind the glare of his lights. Rex attempted to continue his engine inspection, but his hands were shaking as he checked fluid levels and examined components, knowing that they were being watched by someone whose intentions were unknown, but almost certainly malicious. The mechanical problem that had forced their stop became more suspicious when Rex discovered that their cooling system had been deliberately sabotaged. Fresh tool marks around the drain plug indicated that someone had loosened it with pliers, allowing coolant to leak out gradually until the engine overheated. The sabotage had been expertly timed. The coolant loss had been slow enough that they'd made it well away from populated areas before the engine failure forced them to stop, but fast enough that they'd be stranded in an isolated location where help would be far away and witnesses non-existent. As Rex made this discovery, they noticed that Nighthawk had left his truck and was walking around his trailer, carrying something that reflected the harsh LED lights of the truck stop. The smell that began drifting across the parking lot was unmistakable, the metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with chemical odors that suggested cleaning agents or preservatives. When Rex aimed his flashlight toward Nighthawk's trailer, the beam revealed a steady stream of dark liquid dripping from the trailer's rear corner, pooling on the asphalt in a spreading stain that looked black under the artificial lighting. Nighthawk emerged from behind his trailer, no longer attempting to conceal his activities or maintain any pretense of normal behavior. He stood in clear view, approximately 30 feet away, wiping his hands on a rag that appeared to be saturated with the same dark substance dripping from his trailer. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle as he studied Diane and Rex, and his lips were moving in a repetitive pattern as if he was rehearsing words he planned to say. The expression on his face was a mechanical smile that suggested someone playing a role rather than expressing genuine emotion. Diane immediately began calling for emergency assistance on her CB radio, while Rex retreated toward their truck, keeping his flashlight trained on Nighthawk's position. The response from law enforcement was complicated by their remote location. They were in a jurisdictional gray area between counties, and the nearest patrol unit was at least 20 minutes away. But their radio call was intercepted by other truckers in the area, and several drivers began converging on their location to provide assistance, creating the possibility that Nighthawk would be outnumbered if he attempted to escalate the situation. Nighthawk began walking toward their truck with measured, deliberate steps that suggested someone who had rehearsed this approach many times before. His movements were controlled and purposeful, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that might be expected from someone acting impulsively. When he reached their truck, he pressed his palms against the hood and maintained that same mechanical smile while staring directly at Diane through the windshield. His behavior suggested someone who was following a script, playing out a scenario he had planned and practiced repeatedly. The most terrifying moment came when they heard sounds from inside Nighthawk's trailer, muffled pounding and desperate voices that suggested someone was trapped inside and trying to escape. The sounds were clearly human, indicating that whatever Nighthawk had been doing behind his trailer, it involved live victims who were conscious and aware of their situation. The realization that they were witnessing an active kidnapping and torture operation sent Rex into action, starting their truck despite the cooling system problems and preparing to flee regardless of potential engine damage. Nighthawk's expression changed instantly when he heard the voices from his trailer, the fake smile disappearing into something cold and furious. He sprinted back toward his trailer while pulling something from his jacket that appeared to be either a syringe or a small knife, revealing that he had been prepared to silence his victims if they threatened to expose his activities. His reaction confirmed that the sounds from the trailer represented a serious threat to his operation and that he was willing to use immediate violence to maintain control of the situation. Diane and Rex fled the truck stop at maximum speed, clipping a concrete barrier as they escaped, while their overheated engines screamed in protest. Their mirrors showed Nighthawk standing in the middle of the road behind them, not attempting to pursue but watching their departure with the same analytical attention he'd shown throughout their encounter. His lack of pursuit suggested either that he was confident they couldn't identify him definitively or that he had already accomplished whatever reconnaissance mission their encounter had served. Their truck's engine failed completely after 12 miles, leaving them stranded on a highway shoulder near an overpass where they waited for law enforcement assistance. The responding officers revealed that their call wasn't the first report they'd received about Nighthawk. Similar encounters had been reported by other drivers over several weeks, but law enforcement had been unable to locate the suspect or gather sufficient evidence to make an arrest. The consistency of the reports suggested that Nighthawk had been conducting a systematic campaign targeting truckers along established freight corridors. The investigation that followed their encounter revealed the full scope of Nighthawk's operation in the sophisticated mobile prison he had created inside his trailer. When law enforcement located his abandoned truck, they discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall that had been equipped with restraints bolted to the floor and walls covered in scratch marks from previous victims. The compartment was described as a dungeon-like torture chamber that enabled prolonged imprisonment and abuse of victims while maintaining the appearance of a normal commercial trailer. The victim they had heard calling for help was identified as a college student who had been missing for 2 days, found alive but severely dehydrated and showing signs of repeated drugging. Personal items from at least 6 other victims were discovered hidden in various compartments throughout the trailer, including identification documents and personal effects that connected Nighthawk to disappearances across multiple states. The evidence suggested that he had been operating his mobile torture chamber for an extended period, using his legitimate trucking business as cover for systematic predatory activities. Nighthawk's real identity was revealed to be Walter Simmons, a long-haul trucker with extensive knowledge of highway systems and law enforcement patrol patterns. His escape from the truck stop demonstrated the same level of planning and preparation that had characterized his entire operation. He vanished into the prairie darkness on foot, apparently having prepared contingency plans for abandoning his operation if it was discovered. The manhunt that followed involved helicopters and tracking dogs, but Simmons had apparently prepared multiple escape routes and may have had additional vehicles staged for such emergencies. The investigation revealed that Simmons had been using CB radio communications to identify and track potential victims, building detailed profiles of their routes, schedules, and vulnerability factors. His interest in drivers who traveled alone, his questions about personal circumstances, and his apparent ability to predict where specific trucks would be at particular times all indicated systematic surveillance and intelligence-gathering operations. The mechanical sabotage that had forced Diane and Rex to stop suggested that he had developed sophisticated methods for creating situations where potential victims would be isolated and vulnerable. The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies and trucking companies, demonstrating how professional criminals could use legitimate trucking operations as cover for organized predatory activities. Simmons had invested considerable resources in creating a mobile torture chamber that could operate across multiple jurisdictions while avoiding detection, and his knowledge of trucking industry practices had enabled him to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of isolated drivers. The sophistication of his operation suggested that highway predation had evolved to a level of organization and resources that most law enforcement agencies weren't prepared to address. For Diane and Rex, the encounter with Nighthawk served as a stark reminder that their years of experience and caution couldn't protect them from predators who had invested equivalent time and effort in studying their potential victims. The realization that someone had been systematically tracking their movements, sabotaging their equipment, and planning to add them to his collection of victims created lasting psychological trauma that would affect their approach to trucking for the remainder of their careers. The most disturbing aspect of the entire investigation was the discovery that Simmons had been successful multiple times before being discovered, and that his mobile torture chamber had enabled him to commit crimes across multiple states while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that weren't equipped to address jurisdictional challenges posed by mobile predators. The scratch marks on the walls of his hidden compartment told a story of multiple victims who had suffered prolonged imprisonment and torture, and investigators suspected that the personal items found in his trailer represented only a fraction of his actual victims. The case exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in highway security and law enforcement coordination that enabled predators like Simmons to operate across jurisdictional boundaries while exploiting the isolation and predictability that made long-haul trucking attractive to both legitimate drivers and the criminals who hunted them. Nighthawk's collection wasn't just a mobile torture chamber. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had turned America's highway system into a hunting ground where predators with sufficient resources and planning could operate with near impunity. The investigation continues, with law enforcement agencies working to identify additional victims and determine the full scope of Simmons' activities during his years of operation. But for the trucking community, the case has served as a watershed moment in understanding how highway predation had evolved from opportunistic crime to organized operations with resources and capabilities that rivaled professional intelligence gathering and military-style logistics coordination. Sarah Chen had been driving trucks for less than 6 months when she made the decision that would either save her life or end it. Accepting her first solo run from Fort Worth to Beaumont during the last week of June 2023. Her training supervisor had been hesitant to let her take the assignment, not because he questioned her driving skills, but because the route included several stretches of isolated highway where rookie drivers could find themselves in situations their training hadn't prepared them to handle. Sarah had insisted she was ready for the responsibility, and her dispatch records showed she'd been performing well during her supervised runs, but nothing in her brief trucking career had prepared her for what was waiting at mile marker 217 on Highway 190 outside of Huntsville. The load she was hauling wasn't particularly valuable. Industrial cleaning supplies destined for a chemical plant near the Gulf Coast, but it represented a crucial step in her professional development. Completing her first solo run successfully would qualify her for more lucrative assignments and demonstrate to her company that their investment in her training had been worthwhile. Sarah had planned her route carefully, identifying truck stops and rest areas where she could take her mandatory breaks while staying on schedule for her morning delivery appointment. What she hadn't anticipated was how the isolation of driving alone would affect her judgment when she encountered what appeared to be a fully operational truck stop in an area where her GPS showed nothing but empty highway. The facility appeared suddenly in her headlights at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a well-lit complex of fuel pumps, parking areas, and a travel center building that looked identical to dozens of legitimate truck stops she'd visited during her training. The signage was professional and properly maintained, advertising fuel brands, food services, and trucker amenities that would be expected at any reputable establishment. Most importantly, the prices displayed on the fuel signs were significantly lower than what she'd seen at the last truck stop 50 miles back, making it an attractive option for someone operating on the tight budget margins that defined entry-level trucking. Sarah pulled into the facility and parked her truck near the fuel pumps, noting that the lot was completely empty despite the late hour. That wasn't particularly unusual. Many truck stops experienced light traffic during the early morning hours, especially in rural areas where freight movement was less concentrated. The absence of other vehicles actually seemed like a positive sign, suggesting she wouldn't have to wait for fuel or compete for parking spaces when she was ready to continue her journey. It was only when Sarah approached the main building that she began to notice details that didn't match her initial impression of a functioning truck stop. The building's windows were dark, despite the external lighting that suggested the facility was open 24 hours. The advertising displays were faded and weathered in ways that indicated months or years of exposure without maintenance. Most tellingly, there were no tire tracks or oil stains in the parking areas where trucks would normally park, suggesting that the facility hadn't seen regular commercial traffic in considerable time. Before Sarah could process these warning signs and return to her truck, a man emerged from the shadows near the building's entrance. He appeared to be in his 40s, average height and build, wearing clothing that suggested he might be an employee or manager of the facility. His initial approach was friendly and professional, introducing himself as Vernon and explaining that he was conducting maintenance on the fuel systems during the overnight hours when traffic was normally light. His explanation for the facility's apparent inactivity was plausible and delivered with the kind of casual competence that suggested legitimate familiarity with truck stop operations. Vernon engaged Sarah in conversation about her route, her experience level, and her impressions of the trucking industry, demonstrating knowledge of transportation terminology and industry practices that reinforced his credibility as someone connected to the business. His questions seemed reasonable for someone making casual conversation with a driver during a fuel stop, and his manner was relaxed and unthreatening. Sarah found herself discussing her career goals, her training experience, and her plans for building a successful trucking business, appreciating the opportunity to talk with someone who seemed to understand the challenges facing new drivers. But as their conversation continued, Vernon began demonstrating knowledge about Sarah's specific route and schedule that he couldn't have obtained through casual questioning. He mentioned details about her pickup location, her delivery appointment, and even the name of her dispatcher that suggested either access to confidential company information or extensive surveillance of her activities. When Sarah asked how he could know such specific details about her assignment, Vernon claimed that truckers often discussed their loads and routes over CB radio, and that experienced people in the industry learned to pay attention to such information. Vernon's explanation was technically plausible, but Sarah's instincts were beginning to suggest that something about their encounter wasn't adding up correctly. His knowledge of her personal information seemed too detailed and specific to be explained by casual CB radio monitoring, and his presence at an apparently abandoned truck stop during the early morning hours was beginning to seem less like coincidence and more like deliberate positioning. Most disturbing was his apparent familiarity with her truck's appearance and license number, details he mentioned casually but couldn't have observed from his position near the building. When Sarah indicated that she needed to return to her truck and continue her journey, Vernon's demeanor shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. His friendly manner remained, but underneath it was a persistence that bordered on aggressive behavior. He continued their conversation while walking alongside her toward her truck, making observations about her inexperience and vulnerability that seemed designed to undermine her confidence rather than provide helpful advice. His comments about the dangers facing rookie drivers became increasingly specific and threatening, delivered with a familiarity that suggested personal experience rather than general knowledge. As they approached her truck, Sarah discovered that her rear tires had been slashed with precision cuts that would make driving impossible without risking catastrophic failure. The sabotage had been expertly executed. The cuts were positioned to cause gradual air loss rather than immediate blowouts, ensuring that she would be stranded at the truck stop rather than experiencing a sudden failure that might attract attention from passing motorists. The timing of the sabotage indicated that Vernon had been monitoring her activities since her arrival and had used their conversation as a distraction while accomplishing his real purpose. Vernon's reaction to Sarah's discovery of the tire damage was revealing in its lack of surprise or concern. Instead of offering assistance or expressing shock at the vandalism, he began explaining that such incidents were common at isolated truck stops and that inexperienced drivers often found themselves in vulnerable situations due to their unfamiliarity with the risks associated with overnight stops in remote areas. His advice about how to handle the situation demonstrated knowledge of tire replacement procedures and trucking operations that confirmed his familiarity with the industry. But his tone suggested someone who was enjoying Sarah's predicament rather than sympathizing with it. The most terrifying moment came when Vernon began revealing the extent of his surveillance and preparation activities. He mentioned details about Sarah's personal life, her family relationships, and her financial circumstances that he couldn't have obtained through any legitimate means. His knowledge extended to her home address, her bank account information, and even personal details about her relationships that suggested extensive background investigation or illegal access to private records. The realization that she had been systematically studied and targeted created a level of psychological terror that went far beyond simple concern about tire damage. Vernon's intentions became clear when he offered to help Sarah with her tire problem, explaining that he had replacement tires available and the equipment necessary to install them. But his assistance came with conditions that revealed the predatory nature of his operation. He wanted her to accompany him to a storage facility located several miles away from the truck stop, where he claimed to keep emergency supplies for stranded drivers. His insistence that she travel with him rather than waiting for professional road service demonstrated that her stranding had been part of a coordinated plan to force her into an isolated location where she would be completely vulnerable. Sarah's escape began when she realized that Vernon's detailed knowledge of her situation meant he had been planning this encounter for an extended period, possibly weeks or months. Her truck's CB radio became her lifeline as she contacted other drivers for emergency assistance while barricading herself in her cab and preparing to defend herself if Vernon escalated to physical violence. The response from the trucking community was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple drivers began converging on her location, and experienced truckers provided tactical advice about how to handle her situation until law enforcement could arrive. Vernon's behavior during Sarah's radio calls confirmed that he had been expecting her to be isolated and unable to communicate with potential rescuers. His visible frustration with her ability to summon help suggested that her stranding at the abandoned truck stop was part of a larger plan that required her to be completely cut off from outside assistance. When it became clear that multiple vehicles were responding to her distress call, Vernon attempted to convince Sarah that his intentions were harmless and that she was overreacting to what he claimed was simply an offer to help with legitimate tire replacement services. The arrival of other truckers revealed the full extent of Vernon's operation and the sophisticated trap he had created at the abandoned truck stop. Investigation of the facility showed that it had been closed for over 2 years, but Vernon had maintained the external lighting and signage to create the illusion of an operational business. Hidden surveillance equipment throughout the property indicated that he had been monitoring the highway for potential targets, and the discovery of personal items from other drivers suggested that Sarah wasn't his first victim. Law enforcement investigation revealed that Vernon Thompson was a convicted predator with extensive knowledge of trucking industry operations gained during a previous career as a legitimate truck driver. His familiarity with driver psychology, industry terminology, and operational procedures had enabled him to create convincing scenarios for luring unsuspecting truckers into vulnerable situations. The abandoned truck stop had been his base of operations for over 18 months, during which time he had systematically targeted rookie drivers who were traveling alone and unlikely to have established support networks within the trucking community. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that Vernon had been conducting extensive surveillance and background investigation activities targeting drivers who met his preferred victim profile. His files contained detailed dossiers on dozens of truckers, including photographs, personal information, route schedules, and psychological profiles that enabled him to predict their behavior and plan encounters with military precision. The sophistication of his intelligence-gathering operations suggested either professional training in surveillance techniques or extensive personal experience in stalking and predatory behavior. Vernon's arrest revealed a collection of false identification documents, fake business credentials, and equipment for maintaining the illusion of legitimate truck stop operations that had enabled him to operate his predatory scheme for an extended period without detection. His knowledge of trucking industry practices and driver psychology had made him extremely effective at identifying and exploiting vulnerable targets, and his ability to create convincing operational environments had allowed him to lure victims into situations where they were completely isolated and defensible. The investigation that followed Vernon's arrest uncovered evidence linking him to multiple missing persons cases involving commercial drivers who had disappeared while traveling through Texas and surrounding states. Personal items found at the abandoned truck stop included driver's licenses, CB radios, and personal effects from at least 8 different truckers whose disappearances had been investigated as separate incidents rather than connected crimes. The realization that Vernon had been successfully preying on truckers for an extended period created a wave of concern throughout the industry about the vulnerability of isolated drivers to organized predatory activities. For Sarah, the encounter with Vernon served as a brutal introduction to the realities of trucking that her training hadn't addressed. The fact that her profession made her a target for predators who understood both the industry's operational patterns and the psychology of drivers who were isolated and vulnerable on remote highways. The sophisticated nature of Vernon's operation, from his maintenance of the fake truck stop to his detailed surveillance activities, demonstrated that highway predation had evolved to a level of organization and resources that most new drivers couldn't imagine. The case became a training example for trucking companies and law enforcement agencies, demonstrating how predators could use legitimate industry knowledge and sophisticated operational planning to create elaborate traps for unsuspecting drivers. Vernon's success in maintaining his operation for over 18 months while avoiding detection revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in highway security and driver protection that enabled organized criminals to operate with near impunity in isolated areas. The psychological impact of her encounter with Vernon would follow Sarah throughout her trucking career, fundamentally altering her approach to overnight stops, interactions with strangers, and assessment of potential threats on remote highways. The realization that she had walked into an elaborate trap that had been months in the planning created lasting trauma that affected her confidence and decision-making abilities, forcing her to accept that survival in the trucking industry required constant vigilance and the understanding that predators were always looking for new ways to exploit the vulnerabilities of isolated drivers. Vernon's game had been revealed as a sophisticated predatory operation that combined industry knowledge, psychological manipulation, and elaborate staging to create scenarios where victims would voluntarily place themselves in vulnerable situations. The abandoned truck stop, the tire slashing, and the detailed personal information were all tools in a predatory toolkit designed to exploit the trust and professionalism that made the trucking industry function, turning those positive qualities into weapons that could be used against the drivers who embodied them. Marcus Thompson had been pulling freight across America's highways for 30 years, and in that time, he'd learned to distinguish between the genuine emergencies that required immediate assistance and the elaborate traps that predators used to exploit the decent instincts of professional drivers. 3 decades of experience had taught him to trust his gut feelings about people and situations, which was why the encounter he had on October 29, 2023, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, shattered every assumption he'd made about his ability to recognize danger and respond appropriately to human suffering. Marcus was running a time-sensitive load of automotive parts from Detroit to Charlotte, following a route that took him through some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States. The mountain highways of Virginia and West Virginia were notorious among truckers for their steep grades, sharp curves, and limited visibility, but they also offered some of the most scenic driving in the country during the fall months when the changing leaves created spectacular displays of color that made the difficult driving conditions worthwhile. Marcus had always preferred mountain routes to the monotonous stretches of interstate highway that characterized much of long-haul trucking, finding that the constant attention required by mountain driving helped maintain his alertness during overnight runs. It was exactly 3:30 in the morning when Marcus first spotted the girl in his headlights, approximately 2 miles past the summit of a mountain pass that marked one of the most remote sections of his route. She appeared to be a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old, running along the shoulder of the highway in a way that suggested desperate flight from some immediate threat. Her clothing was torn and blood-soaked, and her movement patterns indicated severe injuries that were affecting her coordination and endurance. Most disturbing was the apparent source of her injuries: deep lacerations on her arms, legs, and face that suggested either a violent assault or some kind of accident involving sharp objects. Marcus's initial reaction was immediate and instinctive. He began slowing his truck and preparing to offer assistance to someone who was obviously in desperate need of medical attention. 30 years of driving had taught him that the isolation of mountain highways meant that emergency medical services could be an hour or more away from remote locations, and that the difference between life and death often depended on the willingness of passing motorists to provide immediate help to accident victims. The girl's injuries appeared severe enough that delay in treatment could result in death from blood loss, making immediate intervention a moral imperative regardless of any potential risks to his own safety. As Marcus brought his truck to a controlled stop on the shoulder, the girl ran toward his cab with obvious relief, waving her arms and calling out for help in a voice that conveyed genuine terror and desperation. Her injuries were even more severe than they had appeared from distance. The blood loss was significant enough that she was becoming unsteady on her feet, and the lacerations on her face and arms appeared to be deep enough to require surgical repair. Most concerning was her obvious state of shock, which manifested in rapid speech patterns and difficulty maintaining coherent communication about what had happened to her and where she had come from. The girl's story, delivered in fragments between gasps for breath and periods of obvious pain, suggested that she had been the victim of a violent assault at a remote cabin somewhere in the mountains above their location. She claimed that multiple attackers had held her captive for several days, during which time she had been subjected to torture and sexual assault that had resulted in her current injuries. Her escape had apparently occurred when her captors became intoxicated and careless about security, allowing her to flee into the forest and eventually reach the highway where Marcus had found her. Her desperate pleas for help were accompanied by specific details about her captors' activities and threats that added credibility to her story. She mentioned names, described physical characteristics of her alleged attackers, and provided information about the location of the cabin where she claimed to have been held captive. Most convincingly, her injuries appeared consistent with the torture and abuse she described, and her obvious terror and trauma seemed genuine rather than manufactured. Marcus found himself believing her story completely and feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility to get her to safety as quickly as possible. The girl insisted that calling local law enforcement would be dangerous because she believed her captors had connections to corrupt police officers who had been involved in her kidnapping. Instead, she begged Marcus to drive her to a location deeper in the mountains where she claimed her family had a cabin, and where she would be safe from her attackers until she could contact federal authorities who weren't compromised by local corruption. Her fear of local police seemed genuine and was delivered with specific details about officers' names and their alleged involvement in criminal activities that added credibility to her claims. Against his better judgment and his normal practice of involving law enforcement in any emergency situation, Marcus agreed to help the girl reach her family's cabin. Her injuries were obviously severe, her terror appeared genuine, and her claims about police corruption were delivered with convincing specificity. Most importantly, her blood loss was significant enough that he believed she might not survive the time required to summon emergency medical services to their remote location. Getting her to safety immediately seemed more important than following proper procedures that might result in her death while waiting for help to arrive. The girl directed Marcus onto a series of increasingly narrow and remote mountain roads that led away from the main highway into areas where his truck could barely navigate the tight curves and steep grades. Her knowledge of the area seemed genuine, and her directions were delivered with the kind of familiarity that suggested extensive experience with these mountain roads. But as they traveled deeper into the wilderness, Marcus began noticing inconsistencies in her story and behavior that triggered the survival instincts that 30 years of trucking had developed. The most disturbing realization came when Marcus noticed that the girl's injuries, while obviously painful and bloody, weren't producing the kind of continuous bleeding that would be expected from wounds as severe as they appeared. Her clothing was saturated with blood, but the bleeding had apparently stopped completely, suggesting either that her injuries weren't as severe as they looked, or that they had been inflicted some time earlier than her story suggested. More troubling was his observation that some of the blood on her clothing appeared to have different consistency and color than what would be expected from fresh human wounds. Marcus's suspicions intensified when he realized that the girl was directing him toward an area where he would be completely isolated, and where his truck would be difficult to maneuver if he needed to escape quickly. The mountain roads were becoming increasingly narrow and twisting, with limited opportunities to turn around a large commercial vehicle. Most concerning was his growing awareness that the girl seemed to be deliberately leading him away from any populated areas or main roads where help might be available if he encountered trouble. The trap was revealed when they reached what the girl claimed was her family's cabin, but which turned out to be a staging area where several armed men were waiting in concealment. The girl's demeanor changed instantly once they arrived at the location. Her apparent pain and terror disappeared, replaced by cold calculation as she signaled to the hidden attackers that their target had been successfully delivered. Her injuries, while real, had been carefully inflicted and managed to create a convincing appearance of recent trauma while avoiding any damage that would affect her ability to function as bait in their elaborate trap. Marcus realized that he had walked directly into an organized ambush that had used his own decency and professional instincts against him. The girl's injuries had been deliberately self-inflicted to create a convincing victim scenario that would exploit his natural inclination to help someone in apparent distress. Her knowledge of the mountain roads, her convincing performance as a trauma victim, and her carefully crafted story about police corruption had all been designed to manipulate him into voluntarily traveling to an isolated location where he would be completely vulnerable to attack. The escape that followed tested every skill that Marcus had developed during 30 years of mountain driving and countless encounters with dangerous situations. Using his truck's size and weight as weapons, he smashed through barriers that the attackers had positioned to prevent his departure and maneuvered his vehicle down mountain roads that weren't designed to accommodate commercial traffic at high speed. The girl and her accomplices pursued him in pickup trucks that were better suited to the terrain, but Marcus's experience with mountain driving and his truck's superior mass gave him advantages that ultimately allowed him to reach the main highway before his attackers could disable his vehicle. The investigation that followed Marcus's escape revealed the full scope of the criminal organization that had been operating in the Appalachian Mountains and using elaborate victim scenarios to lure truckers into isolated locations where they could be robbed, killed, or disappeared entirely. The girl, identified as Jennifer Holbrook, was a 24-year-old woman with extensive experience in theater and makeup who had been specifically recruited for her ability to portray convincing trauma victims. Her injuries were real but carefully controlled, inflicted, and maintained at levels that would create sympathy without compromising her ability to function as bait. The criminal network that Jennifer worked for had been operating for over 3 years, using various victim scenarios to target truckers traveling through remote mountain areas where law enforcement presence was minimal and escape routes were limited. Their success rate had been high because they understood both the psychology of professional drivers and the operational vulnerabilities created by mountain terrain that limited communication and made escape difficult. The organization had developed multiple victim scenarios, including injured children, stranded motorists, and accident victims, all designed to exploit the decent instincts of drivers who were conditioned to help people in distress. Investigation of the group's activities revealed evidence of multiple successful attacks on commercial drivers, including several cases where truckers had disappeared entirely and were presumed dead. The organization had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of vehicles and cargo while eliminating witnesses, and their knowledge of remote mountain locations had enabled them to operate with near impunity for years. Most disturbing was the discovery that they had been specifically targeting experienced drivers like Marcus, recognizing that veterans of the trucking industry were more likely to carry valuable cargo and were more challenging to successfully trap than inexperienced drivers. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation revealed that Jennifer and her accomplices had studied trucker psychology and behavior patterns with the thoroughness of professional researchers. They understood that experienced drivers were trained to help people in emergencies, that mountain roads created tactical disadvantages for large vehicles, and that the isolation of Appalachian highways provided perfect conditions for ambushes that could be executed without witnesses or immediate law enforcement response. For Marcus, the encounter with the bleeding girl served as a devastating reminder that 30 years of experience couldn't protect him from predators who had invested equivalent time and effort in studying their potential victims. The realization that his most fundamental instincts, the desire to help someone who appeared to be suffering, had been weaponized against him, created psychological trauma that would affect his approach to emergency situations for the remainder of his career. The girl's convincing performance had exploited not just his professional training, but his basic human decency, turning his best qualities into vulnerabilities that nearly cost him his life. The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies and trucking companies, demonstrating how organized criminals could use sophisticated psychological manipulation and elaborate staging to create scenarios where victims would voluntarily place themselves in dangerous situations. The bleeding girl had represented the culmination of highway predation evolution, predators who understood that the most effective traps were those that exploited their victims' compassion rather than their greed or fear. The investigation revealed that the Appalachian criminal network had been part of a larger, organized crime enterprise that specialized in targeting commercial drivers across multiple states, using various victim scenarios adapted to local conditions and terrain advantages. The bleeding girl scenario had been specifically developed for mountain regions where terrain created tactical advantages for attackers and where the isolation made immediate law enforcement response unlikely. The lasting impact of Marcus's encounter extended far beyond the immediate trauma of nearly being killed. It forced him to accept that his profession had attracted the attention of organized criminals who had studied trucker psychology with academic thoroughness and had developed predatory strategies that could defeat even the most experienced driver's survival instincts. The bleeding girl had taught him that in the vast emptiness of America's most remote highways, the line between compassion and suicide had become impossibly thin, and that survival sometimes required abandoning the very humanity that had made trucking a noble profession. The mountain roads that had once provided Marcus with peaceful solitude and scenic beauty were forever transformed by his encounter with Jennifer and her accomplices. Every emergency he encountered afterward would be filtered through the knowledge that predators were capable of inflicting genuine suffering on themselves in order to create convincing victim scenarios, and that the most dangerous traps were those that appealed to the helper instincts that separated professional drivers from the criminals who hunted them. The bleeding girl had been real, her injuries had been genuine, and her terror had been convincing because it served the purposes of predators who understood that the most effective weapons against decent people were scenarios that demanded decency as a response. In the darkness between Virginia's mountain peaks, Marcus had learned that humanity itself could become a liability when facing enemies who were willing to sacrifice their own humanity in order to exploit the compassion of their victims.